This is Paul Nobles from Eat to Perform. I am sitting here with April Blackford. April, if you want to say hi to everyone.
Hi, everyone.
So, once again, we're sort of changing the theme a bit. Whether you're watching on YouTube or listening on our podcast, we've kind of gone to more themes as we've moved towards more of a podcast oriented type of thing. And that seems to be received fairly well. So, tonight, one of the things that I thought I'd go over is, and kind of, April has been sort of the engineer with me, and I'll run through what I mean by that when we're talking a little bit later. But uh, when we started Eat to Perform 3 years ago and what it is now, there are some major differences. And I think in general, people will often say things like, well, it's all very confusing. And to me, it seems fairly simple. And so I thought I might explain to you guys the way that I think of it, and then maybe that might help you guys in terms of your thought process. Of course, I'm going to do my standard long answer, so it probably will go for close to an hour, but my plain and simple explanation will go into various things we've sort of figured out along the way, and then also how exercise plays a role. And I started thinking about it today, April, like, is there anything that you can think of that ties both exercise and nutrition together? I know, like, I remember like P90X and Insanity had like a component where they like threw in some kind of nutrition info, but it wasn't like a thing. And I think like Daily Burn and those guys, they try to do something, but I think they're really more of a exercise. Can you think of anything off the top of your head that I'm missing? Because honestly, I really can't think of. It seems like people want to go one way or the other.
I would say no, not as detailed as we do with the nutrition. Like what you said, the Beachbody stuff, they'll do, kind of basic, eat this amount, but it doesn't really tailor to, amounts, serving sizes based on someone's body weight, things like that. So I would say no.
Well, I would argue that we don't do a great job of it from the standpoint of outward facing. Now, when you join Eat to Perform and you ask a coach, hey, do you have a training program that I could do because I don't have a gym, or even if you do have a gym, or there are ways that I can change the workouts from what I'm doing right now to something that's a little bit more in line with my goals. That's part of what we do. But I don't think that the good majority of people that think of Eat to Perform from the standpoint of exercise programs with a clear definition of what that is. Does that make sense?
Yes.
I would think the good majority of people think of us, like I would say that there's your Juggernaut, your P90X, your CrossFit, and then people probably put us more in like the MyFitnessPal, Paleo, Weight Watchers box, right? And we're actually sort of a merging of the two, and so we'll sort of talk about that a little bit. Um, One of the things that I thought I'd kind of start things off with was I was gone for the weekend, and I'll go into a little bit of my thoughts as it relates to long endurance, but I definitely had an epiphany on Friday, because one of the things that I decided to do was to have more food available, because I was sort of hitting that 13, 14 mile um, like limit, and my body was definitely bothered by it. So I started talking to a few of the runners at my gym, and they were like, yeah, you're experiencing like the bonk. And I was like, no, like there's no way that soon you would go totally empty. And, turns out they were 100% correct. I ran 16 miles. We were at a cabin in Grand Marais, Minnesota. Basically, all I did was kind of run, and we were on a dead-end street that was about 5 miles long. And so what I did was just kind of run back and forth on the street. It had a slight incline, but it wasn't too hilly, and it wasn't too bad one way or the other. But, I kind of hit that wall, around mile 11 last couple weeks. And so this week, when I sort of hit it, I kind of knew that I could go to the cabin and, just kind of load up on whatever I had available. And it wasn't probably the types of foods that I will use going in the future. I mean, it ended up being like popcorn and Starburst and Oreos. I think going forward, I'll be more prepared and probably have things like bananas and almonds, like salty smokehouse almond type of stuff. What was interesting was I was really craving potato chips. Not only, really, it's sort of interesting because it seems like a carb intensive type activity, and certainly is, but it's really a calorie intensive. One of the things that the gal at my gym said was that most people use somewhere in the neighborhood of about a 300 calorie replacement factor for each hour. And I would think that that's pretty close to right. And so I am going to be a little bit more prepared. But what was the most hilarious thing about it is the last couple weeks. And once again, I'm like the eat perform guy, but my part of my thinking was, that, your body should be efficient enough to be able to use fats and then just eat afterwards. But as I start to go into 16, 18, 20 miles, I'm going to have to be a little bit more prepared. So I started asking some friends of mine that do it. So this week I was at 14 miles and at mile 11, I just decided to go in and eat some food. And I kind of ate, a lot of food, a lot more. Like I was a little concerned about being uncomfortable as I ran. And sure enough, first of all, my carb drink, which I've always recommended to people, which is 15 grams of carbohydrates with 24 ounces of water, and then a Nuntab, that worked great. I mean, like you don't get that sloshy feeling that sometimes you do when you just drink water. It's so funny. We watched the 2015 CrossFit Games, and if there was one person that was drinking a legitimate carb drink, I did not see it. I mean, all I saw was people with water, and mostly the water, they were just pouring it on themselves to cool off. They didn't have a hydration strategy. It's sort of interesting because we're going to be talking to Doug Chapman here soon, and I'm going to be kind of asking him his thoughts on how people hydrate for something like that. But the long story short with that, and that's actually not the story that I wanted to start off with, but the long story short was that from mile 11 to mile 16 was like a breeze. I mean, it was like the easiest thing. I mean, literally the last couple weeks, I felt like I wanted to cut off my legs until I got food in and my body sort of acclimated. Then it was like, phew, But this week, it was great. I mean, and I left there. We went as a family. I think I ran from like 1 to 4:30 or something like that. And then we went out as a family for that evening, and seemingly no ill effects at all. So the food definitely made a difference. Any thoughts on that? Because it sounds kind of silly, like the eat to perform guy, but I guess I really thought that it would be I'd be fine enough, right? And then what was happening is in the past couple weeks, I would leave there and I would just scarf down all this food. When I was able to snack in between, I wasn't really hungry. Afterwards, I didn't feel this need to eat a large amount of food. And my body just recovered a lot better.
I would just that I think your microphone is causing me to echo.
I'm not hearing an echo on my side, but
okay. All right, I hear the echo. I would just say that moving forward, that obviously this is a lesson learned, because here I am all along thinking that you were doing some level of carbohydrates during all these long runs.
Well, if you look at the carb drink that I was just describing, that's only 60 calories.
Yeah,
and so yeah, I've had that before. But just having to have a better strategy. I mean, it's like people are probably listening to this going, duh. Well, I think it's one of those things that as you get past that 10-mile barrier, first of all, from 1 to 10 miles, absolutely, I would not need any type of rehydration, even though it would be, up to 2 hours. I could just eat afterwards and be fine. But, as we start to go into 16, 18, 20 miles, now we're going to have a better strategy. So, and the nice thing is that I really wasn't that prepared this time. I mean, other than the fact that I had food in my cabin. So knowing sort of what my body might be craving and having that available, I think will be kind of an interesting strategy. The other thing that I wanted to talk about, we were coming back from Duluth, we were coming back from Grand Marais, which is northern Minnesota, close to the Canadian border. And then we were coming back through Duluth. And, my daughters are kind of picky. And we stopped at this one restaurant that we normally stop in to have breakfast, but it was too late in the day and they weren't serving breakfast. And so I was hoping to get soup. My daughters weren't into that. So we still kept on going to Duluth, right? And once we got to Duluth, we ended up getting Jimmy John's. They wanted to eat Jimmy John's. I didn't want to eat Jimmy John's. And so not because I have something against Jimmy John's, and you'll see kind of where I'm going with this in a second. So we ended up going to this little cafe, and it was an Italian cafe overlooking Lake Superior. And it had like Italian sausage soup. And in the soup, they had potatoes, and it was a very salty soup, right? And it had tomatoes in it. And as I was sitting there eating it while dipping my bread into the soup, all I could think was, this is processed meat. It's high in sodium. It's got 2 nightshades in it, right? And all I could think was, this is the epitome of the type of corner people paint themselves into, right? I mean, you'd end up looking all throughout the whole city of Duluth for something that very specifically fits exactly what you need, right? Rather than just going, you know what? I mean, there was nothing bad about the soup. It had potatoes, it was really good soup, actually. But I was just thinking to myself that, even in the past, I would have been someone that would have been a little persnickety about that. That's the other thing. I mean, we'll talk about this here in a second, but the fact that you couldn't count it, that's another thing that sometimes people will sort of bother themselves with it. So then, this comes up a lot when we start talking about our relationships with food and then our relationships with our children, right? So we leave that place, and then my youngest daughter, I mean, like a half block away, goes, "Oh, look, a malt shop," right? And so my thought process was not, I'm going to have a malt, but certainly my daughter is saying, hey, I'd like to have a malt right now. And so we turned around the car and we all had malts. And I thought to myself, that's the kind of thing you should do on vacation. That's the kind of thing that you should enjoy, right? And, one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about the theme that we're about to talk about today is that you can sort of get caught up into what you believe are the rules of any way of eating. And there are other, most systems will say, if any mistake is a big mistake, and you should reset and start over and all this other type of stuff. And I think that that's actually part of the problem, and then when we talk about our relationship with food and being a good example for our children, if you're on vacation and you can't have foods outside of whatever you consider your little box to be in, that's the problem, right? So you need to get out of that box. And so we're going to talk a little bit about what that looks like. But what I wanted to say was I didn't work out that day. I didn't have a lot of steps that day. And so and then, today, I woke up, I look in the mirror, and I'm fine, right? I mean, there was really, if anything, I was kind of leaner than I might normally be. And I think we sort of get into this routine. I mean, certainly, if you're going to have a lot of calories on any given day, having activity around those calories probably makes more sense than not. But it doesn't mean every single day. Doesn't mean that you can't deviate from that plan on occasion. I think people will often, sort of get to a point where they feel kind of pushed into a corner. And what I'm trying to say is that that's actually kind of a net negative. I mean, it does help in my instance, and we're going to talk about that here soon. But, you're not dieting all the time, right? And that's part of the kind of the nice part of Eat to Perform. Do you have any thoughts about that? Because I mean, obviously, you have kids. I mean, you've got a college age child, and then you have kids that live in your house. I mean, how do you deal with that kind of stuff?
I think that I think that what you're describing is what Eat to Perform is all about. And, what it should be is gaining a better relationship, not only with food, but also not letting it control your life, and, being able to enjoy time with your children or your family and not stress over, is this going to fit, or is this going to, is this got nightshades in it or whatever. A funny story, you're talking about your story over the weekend. Me and Tom and my son, we went to our beach house in Virginia Beach this past weekend, and we had yard work and stuff like that to do. Because we evicted the tenant that we used to have there watching over the property. But we had worked in the yard like 5 hours on Saturday. So I naturally did not eat as much. I ate a lot that day, but, wasn't as rigid on, kind of schedule, making sure I ate breakfast, lunch, dinner, snacks, things like that. So what happens Sunday, I get up, we don't keep the house fully stocked with groceries, basically just what you're going to eat. And I basically ate for breakfast. Years ago, I would never have done this, but I ate 3 eggs, 6 pieces of bacon, and ribs for breakfast. That was my breakfast. And any other time, I would never have eaten that. But it was just all about, nutrients and energy, and things like that. And, just the mere being able to, enjoy time with your children and not have them seeing you restricting food, or, because I have 2 older daughters, and the girls, I think, are a lot more impressionable than the boys, but they watch us and they know what we do, and they see that and they see those behaviors, and sometimes it can kind of transfer, to their behaviors. And that's the last thing that I want them to do is to, give my child a disordered relationship with food.
So I am changing to my built-in microphone because people are saying that they cannot hear you. And so I'm going to try and fix that. Because I'm assuming that when I had to mute my microphone, I don't know how that would have affected the broadcast, but we might not have as good of audio for the podcast as we move forward. But yeah, I mean, like what you're saying, I think is, really sort of the core of having a better relationship with food. And the thing that's interesting, and I said this in my write-up that's actually going to turn into a post here in the next few days. But what I said was, because I think there's a lot of people that would go, oh my goodness, he had Starburst and Oreos. Why couldn't he have just had chicken and kale? And the thing is that, I needed calories at that point. I didn't need, nutrients at that point. And it doesn't mean that I'm not a fan of nutrients, right? I will eat chicken and kale, right? But I'm just saying that at that point, certainly I think during that workout, I burned 2,400 calories. I'm absolutely certain I didn't eat more than, say, 500 calories worth of Starburst, popcorn, and Oreos at the time. So maybe 600 to 700 actually. But it was not an extreme amount of calories is sort of the point. And I think that people focus a little too much on food quality at times when they just need calories, right? And so that's something to think about. So one of the things that when I started talking about the theme of tonight's podcast, and I just wanted to ask if everybody can now hear April, and then Charlie's saying yes, that worked. So apparently my microphone being muted you. So it'll be interesting to hear if that affected the
My bacon story.
What now?
My bacon story.
Yeah, it affected the story. So I sent April a message when I was starting to think about tonight's theme, and what I was reading a book on simplicity, and it was talking about why Apple, from a marketing standpoint, was so much better than HP and Microsoft and all these other companies that sort of lost their way. And Apple has always been able to maintain this like startup mentality. And I would argue Google probably has some similar things going in a positive direction. But what was interesting was how they were just talking about simplistic things, and they would have meetings with very small amounts of people. And I think, to our meetings with Eat to Perform, and how, when, we're in smaller groups, we're able to be a little bit more effective. And then when we have, big meetings with 26 people, sometimes the wheels come off. And so, it's just too many cooks in the kitchen, and not everyone, there's probably 14 of the people in those meetings going, I have no idea why I'm here, So we're, after reading this, I think that we have one meeting like that every week, and every week it does end up kind of being a little bit of a train wreck. So we'll probably change that a little bit. But what I thought I'd talk to people about and then unpack the ideas was one, a one sentence line of, how to easily do Eat to Perform. And that is the goal of Eat to Perform is to teach you to eat an adequate amount for what you do, continuously pushing the what you do part. And what I think happens for a lot of people is they start off eating less, and then, eating less kind of works for a little while, and then all of a sudden that stops, and then people start doing more, and that worked for a while, and then people stop. And then, they hit this like end of the road, and they're not exactly where they want to be, right? And what we're saying and what we've been saying for 3 years now is not necessarily new, but it is different and new to the population that we're talking to, because the majority of the people that are my age, which is 47, how old are you, April?
38.
I don't think I'm supposed to ask you that, but
I'm 38. I'm proud to say I'm 38.
You're 10 years younger than me.
And
But well, 9 years younger than me. But to our audience, to 38-year-old females, to 47-year-old males, there aren't a lot of people saying you should continuously push who you are as a human being. You should continuously thrive. And I know a lot of people think that they think that, but what they're really sort of telling people is, you know, exercise, but eat clean, you know, and then the message like doesn't make mathematical sense, right? You know, like as an example, and I know it's going to go contrary to the young people that I was just talking about, but I was talking to two of our CrossFit Games athletes, and I said to them that, you know, I did their calculations and they were supposed to be eating somewhere in the neighborhood of 4,800 calories a day. And they were like, oh my goodness, you know, how am I ever going to eat that much food? And so I sent them one of our athletes that is eating that much food, who has seen tremendous gains, and showed to show them examples like, this is what this person's been eating for the last 2 years. He went from 160 pounds, now he's 195. He was lifting this and now he's lifting this. And if I'm them, there's a part of me that's thinking, I don't get why I need to eat what you're saying, because I'm already a CrossFit Games athlete. And my argument to them, and I said this directly to them, so I'm not like sharing any trade secrets or anything, but I said to them, if getting to the CrossFit Games is your goal, then keep doing what you're doing. But if winning the CrossFit Games is your goal, then you need to listen to what I'm saying, because your body actually wants to eat this much. You're artificially holding your potential back, you know. And look, I get it. I mean, like CrossFit, the Olympics, I mean, there's a lot of sports that almost require you to be a certain weight. And that's fine. I'm not suggesting that they won't be that weight at some future point. But they're assuming that they're going to gain a lot of weight based on the fact that they're eating 3,200 calories now or whatever they're eating. To be honest with you, most people in that situation don't really know how much they're eating. I mean, I remember having a discussion with one gentleman who, you know, once again, CrossFit Games athlete, and he said to me, he's like, look, dude, here's the deal. You know, for like 2-3 days, he's like, I almost eat nothing. And then, you know, that last day is just like, you know, whatever's in sight, you know, I'll eat. And I said, if you want to get to where you want to go, you're going to need to be a little bit more prepared in the process. You know, you're going to have to, you know, at least have a better strategy as it relates to planning. And sure enough, you know, he, you know, ended up winning his region, ended up, you know, and that was just a conversation. He's not like someone that we work with, but, you know, he did, you know, talk to me later on, and he's like, what you said to me made a really big difference, dude. I was like, yeah, you know, it's amazing what the amount, you know, amounts of food matter, you know. And so, you know, yeah, you know, can you get away with under eating? And can you work out? Absolutely. But are you going to reach your potential? I would say no. And then you go, well, I don't really care about being a CrossFit Games athlete. Well, that's fine, but you're still artificially holding back your metabolism, right? And we are not asking you to eat more food just for the simple fact of eating more food. We're wanting you to increase your metabolism and then increase your output. One of the arguments that I make for long endurance is most people will say, I CrossFit 2 to 3 days a week. And, actual work in that scenario, if it's an hour's class, there's probably 15 to 20 minutes of kind of work, and then there's 15 minutes of high intensity work. Not high intensity the way that I would define high intensity, because a lot of them are pacing that high intensity, but it's still hard work, right? But at the end of the day, okay, you're looking at anywhere between 300 to 500 calories burned in that time period. So a lot of people will say to me, is that enough working out to justify X amount of food? And I still argue that the good majority of people are repressing their metabolism to where, they could really not do much at all and still get away with more food than they're allowing for themselves right now, right? But so let's follow my long endurance example. So somebody WODs 4 times a week at 500 calories. Okay, so that's 2,000 calories. And they'll go, well, I'm not sure that I'm working enough, to eat an adequate amount of food or whatever. And look, I get it. I have a family. It's difficult to sometimes make exercise a priority. And so getting to the gym 3-4 times a week, that's a good thing. But I am making the argument that one day a week, you can have a longer exercise day. And then, like I mentioned on Friday, mine was 2,400. So if you look at that person that's doing 4 days a week, okay, and that's CrossFit. So if you're not doing CrossFit and you're just weightlifting without a whole lot of cardio, without a lot of added lifts and stuff like that, now all of a sudden, in that one workout, I worked out 500 or 400 calories more than you did, right? And I still am able to do WODs through the rest of the week. And so what's nice about it is that I can sort of change my goals, whereas I think most people, if they were truly honest with you, they kind of want to get better at exercise, but they're really sort of earning calories in an effort for body composition or weight to go down or something of this nature, right? And I'm saying that amount of work matters, right? And so if you can have 2,400 calories on one day and then 3 other days of the week, because I get it, like it's hard to work out, for long periods of time, many days. I mean, the CrossFit Games athletes that I was just talking about, those guys work out, 5 hours a day, 6 hours a day sometimes, and a lot of that isn't like long endurance. I mean, they're doing, weightlifting in the morning, kind of a WOD endurance piece, that type of stuff. So it's kind of planned in that way. Any thoughts on what I'm saying here, April? Because I'm sure that there's probably some things that would interest people that would be your thoughts.
I'm actually just listening, waiting for the finale. I agree with what you're saying in regards to increasing output. You talk about all this running, and it kind of makes me want to run a little bit, but I'm waiting till you get up to the 20-mile mark, and then I got to start.
Well, I think that me talking about 16 miles or whatever. I mean, there's people that lift more weight than I do. There's people that run farther than I do. This is just me being me. And so like for you, to run a mile or run a mile and a half, or even hike, or even bike, or even like whatever it is that you want to do. What I'm saying is work always matters. And so for you as an example, I don't think that everyone can work out 3 hours a day, right? But I do think that people could work out 2 hours on one day, right? Or 3 hours on one day. everyone could make that a priority, and if that was a Saturday and then you use that Saturday as a way of, kind of loosening the belt a little bit, then that's a good way to do it, right? But it doesn't have to be running. It just, from my standpoint, it's running, and I'll talk a little bit about why I'm doing the running. I'm doing it as sort of a kinship with runners. I'm doing it to say to runners, hey, you can eat to perform. I think it's, I'm not going to curse, but because I don't know if that makes a big difference on that little E on the podcast, but I think it's idiotic that people talk about the fact that, you can't, you're going to lose all your gains. It's ridiculous to me. If I burn 4,000 calories and I eat 5,000 calories, I'm not losing any gains by running. And in fact, I would argue that I can recover better by not constantly using those energy systems. And one of the things that you often see with exercise is that people, exercise the same energy systems often. And so, tomorrow, as an example, that's my heavy day. I'll be doing reps at, the other day, I was doing, actually, it wasn't too heavy, actually, now that I think about it. But I ended up doing, something like 40 reps within a minute and a half at 225, because it was like a timed event. But, it's routine for me to do like 315 for lots of reps, only days after running 16 miles. It's routine for me to work up to 450-pound 1 rep max only days after running a half marathon. So, I don't mean to be rude to anyone, but I think people are being rude to runners a lot, when they talk about, oh, you're going to lose all your weight training by running. The science doesn't back that up, and especially when you're talking about recovering adequately and eating an adequate amount of food for what you do. And so, I feel great. I'm excited about my workout tomorrow. I'm actually just working back up to over 500 pounds. I've actually never lifted in competition 500 pounds, but I have worked with 500 pounds in my hands a number of times within workouts. Any thoughts on that? Because I think that, a lot of people think to themselves, man, I wonder if there's a way I could get more work in. And so they start thinking to themselves, I could do 2-a-days, I could do this, I could do that. And they don't consider the fact that if you took 1 day of the week and you worked up to having a good cardio base to where you could, row a half marathon or use some level of Airdynes, even though people think I'm crazy when I do that, that those things are net positive.
I think the key would be like what you said, when someone is, trying to figure out how they can do more work, kind of broadening the scope a little bit and not just look at, kind of like me. I'll do, I primarily, lift, I do hypertrophy, as all my assistant stuff. And some days I'll throw in some conditioning, but for the most part, other than spending time with my family, maybe taking a hike and doing something active like that, I don't do cardio, and rather than just looking like me, just looking at my little realm of training of what I do actually do, maybe trying to broaden it a little bit and say, well, maybe this week I'll go rock climbing or, whatever,
I think everyone can do. I think a lot of people are listening to what I'm talking about with long endurance and they're just thinking about the running. That's just my journey. That's my way of doing it. I don't necessarily want people to go to feel imprisoned by what I'm talking about, but I do want them to explore, longer activities. We had someone that, is a competitive kayaker, and they were talking about being on the water for 6 hours. That's the kind of stuff that I'm talking about, whether it's rock climbing, whether it's, hiking, all these things are super positive. And one of the things that we actually talked about when we were talking about how most diets measure success, and we started thinking about how we measure success as a staff. And I actually sent this as a message to someone. But the way that we view a client's success is different than being kind of pigeonholed by this thought process of, because I think when a lot of people come to Eat to Perform, they'll say things like, well, I have 30 pounds to lose. And then I'll say something like, I don't care how much you have to lose, because, frankly, that's not how goals, 30 pounds is like a wish, 5 pounds is a goal, right? And so that's the way that I think of it. And that's the way that I think that we try to impress upon clients, that it's really these expectations, and especially lofty expectations, because, as somebody who, was 230 pounds at one point, and right now I weigh 170 pounds, that's a 60-pound difference. You don't lose 60 pounds going, I need to lose 60 pounds, and every day feeling this burden that 60 pounds is your goal. But if you break it down into 5 pounds, now all of a sudden you have something. And then if you break it down similar to the way that we think with the WAVE method, then it extends the time frame, but it allows you a more patient understanding of what your body actually wants, and so therefore you're able to get there. And I'll talk about the WAVE method in just a second, and then sort of the history of how we sort of came up with that, but because I think that that's important. But what I wanted to talk about was, how we view a client's success, and the first priority is that they change their relationship with themselves, because I think that, part of the expectation that we were just talking about is that if you're, not really comfortable with the person in the mirror, those expectations become a burden. And so, a lot of the times when you've been under eating for years and years, and you've kind of been imprisoned by this diet mindset, just forgiving yourself, I would say that that was a little bit of my journey, right? Forgiving myself for what, like, I think we all consider ourselves fairly intelligent. And then you go, well, okay, buddy, you're intelligent. How'd you end up at 230 pounds? Because, previous to Eat to Perform, all I could think was it was just a lack of will, or a lack of, all the little things added up over time. And it's sort of funny because, if you look at my description of what I was talking about in Duluth, the way that I ate, for that one day was the way that I would have eaten virtually every day, right? When I was eating, without really any thought, I'm talking about in my, mid 20s and into 30s. As I got into my 30s, I became more conscious of the way that I eat, and I was sort of, stuck in the diet mentality, the way that most people are. And then, as I got later in my 30s, I just started realizing that, the standard stuff just wasn't working for me. And then that's ultimately how I became, how I figured out, the whole Eat to Perform methodology. With April, what a lot of people don't realize is that April and I have known each other for close to 6 years now. Mm-hmm. I knew April before I started doing CrossFit, which is something that I think a lot of people don't realize. And so, our second priority for clients is that they change their relationship with food. And we sort of went over that. And then third priority is that you change your relationship with exercise. Because if you're just thinking of exercise as a way of earning food, or you're just thinking of exercise as this burden that you have to do, right, to maintain body composition, And then, of course, if you're under eating, there's just all these negatives that come with it. And if you can flip that script completely with all those 3 priorities, now all of a sudden you actually have the formula for what actually works. And so whether you're trying to gain muscle, whether you're trying to lose fat, you're trying to gain performance, or some combination of these 3, if you don't have those first 3 priorities in place, you will always struggle, because you will always put other things first, when if you put those things first, you'll actually see more success. At least that's what we believe as a staff, what we teach people on a daily basis, and one of the reasons why we've had so much success. I think people will often say, well, have you ever had anyone lose 200 pounds? I'm like, well, I don't think it's realistic to ask me that question until, we're 5 years in, right? We're saying to people, you should be more patient. And we've had a number of people that, have major, weight loss, major fat loss. But in general, we're sticking to our plan. And our plan is, that you can be a more healthy individual today, right? If you have those priorities in place. What are your thoughts on that, April?
I say it almost every day, gradual process, gradual results are sustainable for a lifetime. When, like what you said, I talk to people daily and I tell them the exact same thing, with setting goals. You set goals that are attainable, that, if you set goals that are too large, kind of like me, whereas I don't run, I could run a mile fairly easy, but it's like me signing up for a marathon. When it's going to get closer to the marathon and I haven't ran, when it comes time, it's just going to seem, overwhelming and daunting that I'm never going to be able to do this. Whereas, why not sign up for a 5K first, and then, complete that, and then do a 10K and then a half marathon. Same thing, you set the small goals, attain that, and you're just kind of chipping away at it, overall. And like what you were saying in regards to the weight loss, obviously, there are some people who at some point, do need to lose weight, but, a lot of people can actually fix, or get to a better version of themselves by just losing fat, by getting better at their workouts and, increasing their work capacity and, just by adding muscle mass. That's, rather than focusing on that number. Just like me, I remember, you were talking about how long we've known each other. Remember the days, the last, bulk that I did, and I was, 140 pounds, and all I did was stress about how much fat I had to lose. I have to lose all this fat, whereas, which I did, increase my calories and then, cut body fat. But now I'm actually back, the same weight I was then, but substantially leaner by taking a couple years on just enjoying the process and getting stronger and just, having fun, and not stressing about, the weight, the, dieting, things like that.
Yeah, I mean, people will talk about, hey, when are you going to do your next performance-focused fat loss? And like, I hope never, I mean, like, isn't that the goal? I mean, isn't that the goal, is to get to a body composition that you're comfortable with? I mean, yeah, it might not be 4%, you know what I'm saying? It might not be like Layne Norton, but I'm not really going for Layne Norton. I'm not really going for like professional bodybuilder. I'm really going for most capable version of me. And so I feel like if I can continue on the path that I'm on, that I can get to where I'm at. But I can tell you right now, I can take off my shirt, go on a beach, and I'd feel perfectly comfortable right now today.
Exactly. And that's exactly what I'm talking about. You're just happy. You're happy with your version, that you are now.
Yeah, and a lot of people are gonna go, yeah, well, I mean, you're a relatively fit guy. I mean, what about me? Look, I've always liked the whole, bikini body thing. just put a bikini on your body, and now you have a bikini body. I think that we all overthink that stuff. And I think that, I remember the Dr. Phil thing at one point, it was like his dad's thing. I'm not a big Dr. Phil guy, but I remember he would say that something like his dad would say, if you really knew how often people thought about you, you wouldn't be so concerned about what people think of you. And the idea being that, people aren't preoccupied with you. They're not thinking about what you look like in a bikini. They're just thinking, oh, there's someone on the beach in the bikini. I can't see the ocean anymore. They're not thinking about you. They don't concern themselves with you. And, I think that we're our harshest critic. And, one of the things I was going to say earlier was that if you're like listening to the podcast, you don't know that we're actually sitting here with clients, and people do have the ability to talk to us. And there is one question that I'm going to get to in a second, but with these themes, we don't always go for a lot of questions. What we're really trying to do is get some big chunks out of the way. But what I wanted to talk about was the WAVE method, because previous to the WAVE method, the prescription that we had, and one of the things I always say in seminars is the WAVE method is a method. It's not the method. And what I mean by that is, when you are eating an adequate amount of food for what you do the majority of the time, there are a lot of deficit programs that will work. The problem is that deficit programs at a certain point quit working because you're so focused on the deficit all the time. And Eat Perform is kind of the opposite of that. It's sort of the 180 degrees different than that. We're sort of teaching people to not be dieting the majority of the time. And so the few times that they would see more success. And, it's sometimes relative to how much your metabolism is healed over time, how long have you been dieting, things of this nature. And I remember when I wrote the WAVE method article, it was based off of clients that we were working with at the time, some of the stuff that I had experimented with. But we had always sort of had this, parameter in place where, there would be periods of increase and then periods where you would decrease. But the thing about the WAVE method that I really think changed, even our approach as a staff, was we were allowing people to recover metabolically by using their rest days as a way to decrease calories and kind of keep their average calories lower. And it was fine because it was allowing people to not struggle, but they weren't seeing the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. And that became really super clear over time. And so that's when, I started writing about the WAVE method. The Fitbit was really, instrumental in a lot of the stuff that we're talking about right now, because, what I think a lot of people think is, hey, my Fitbit says I burned 2,300 calories today, but I ate, 1,300 calories today. Why am I not losing any weight? It's like, well, your body's just going to adjust to whatever it is you're giving it. And so what I don't think a lot of people realize is how much the period of non-dieting, right, impacts the period of dieting. In fact, you could argue, and I would argue this fact, that the period of not dieting is actually more important than the period of dieting. And if you are focused on that, that's really kind of the secret, right? And then of course, there's the all the positive things as it relates to your relationship with yourself. When you can eat like a normal human being, you can be social in social settings and things of that nature. But what I think what was most interesting about the WAVE method, because when I first wrote the article, no one had any interest in it at all. And then all of a sudden, people started realizing, whoa, like this guy is saying, like this is, you know, the Eat to Perform fat loss system. And in a sense, that's true, but in a sense, it's not true because, you know, I do believe that there's a lot of ways that you can like skin the cat. But I think that what was happening previous to the wave method was people were just dipping their toes in and they weren't seeing the gold at the end of the rainbow. And so the wave method sort of gave them like, oh yeah, if I can kind of get to this level, then I can gradually get to where I want to go. And what was happening is when you just kind of dip your toe, and if like you're not, you know, if you're listening on the podcast, what you'll see is I'm gradually moving my finger up, but not enough to really make a difference. But when you're doing the wave method, you're really sort of moving in a more concerted effort to get your calories up higher. So then, you know, your cuts are more effective. And then people will focus on, you know, a couple pounds of you know, weight that they gain over that short period of time. But when we talk about, you know, a wave period, you know, you should be losing 8 to 10 pounds. And so if you're up 2 to 3 pounds, it gives your body the potential to add some lean tissue. Certainly you would add more work in that scenario. I mean, one of the things that was interesting about yesterday, you know, coming to Duluth, I don't really do a lot of dairy. I mean, one of the reasons why I don't is because, you know, I mean, I'm like a lot of people, you know, I feel a little bloated, but we've always made the argument, and I certainly would make the argument after yesterday's experience, that bloating is actually a value, because if you allow your body to live in, you know, a state of excess occasionally, then your body will often, you know, be leaner as a result. Your muscles get more filled up. You know, when you look at, you know, some of the descriptions that I made related to Eat to Perform, and you think about, you know, I don't think the good majority of people think about what a diet is supposed to do. Like, what's the mechanism of that diet, right? And so let me just talk real quickly about 3 diets real quick, just so I can give you the basic like duh factor, right? And if you haven't thought of this, you should have thought of this. Like this should be something that should have occurred to you. You look at paleo, okay? It's basically taking out all the foods that bloat you, right? And you go, well, that's good. I don't like feeling bloated. That's fine. If you don't like feeling bloated, paleo will be good for that, but it's not going to be great in terms of getting to be a better athlete long term. And you go, well, what if I ate an adequate amount for what I do? I would still argue that if you're not smart about starches and smart about really some level of bloating, but in general, the whole idea of paleo, like when, you know, paleo has changed so much since the beginning. I mean, we could literally do a podcast on that, and we may do a podcast on that at some point. But the idea is just to keep inflammation down, which kind of argues that inflammation is always bad. And I would argue that inflammation is part of the healing process. It's part of, you know, the process that basically your body needs to thrive, to get better, to build lean tissue, to, you know, all these things. And so as a short-term deficit program, can it be effective? Sure, right? But is it something that you want to rely upon all the time? I would say if you're trying to get better as a human being, that, you know, it has its pitfalls, right? And so some level of inflammation, and I've always liked, you know, like, you know, anytime you say, you know, the word paleo, people are going to think you're using the word paleo in vain. I'm not using the word paleo in vain. I'm actually, you know, making an argument for how you could use paleo effectively. But what I'm saying is that if you're just going to eat, you know, lean, or you're just going to eat fat, or you're just really focused on keeping your inflammation low, there's some net negatives to that. And so you should be aware of that. And so when you look at, let's say, something like the zone, okay, one of the arguments that zone people would say is that, hey, the zone is balanced, and therefore I can have some carbohydrates. I can have, an adequate amount of fat. There is a mechanism in place where I can kind of change my goals, and that's all fine. Okay, but I've never really heard of anyone saying that they eat 48 blocks a day, right? And so if you say roughly, if you look at the athlete that I was talking about earlier, that needs to eat 5,000 calories a day, that's going to be roughly 50 blocks of zone. There is no zone person that eats 50 blocks, right? I've done, somewhere in the order of like 30 to 50 live seminars, and I asked this question, like, do you know anyone that's ever bulked on the zone? And I've never yet had one person say yes. So everyone, sort of knows that zone's a deficit system. Once again, is it an effective deficit system? I would argue that what we teach people with the WAVE method is slightly better than all these systems because it's a little bit more specific. I mean, I was talking to one of our clients the other day, and her high WAVE number was 2,400 calories. I said, have you ever dieted, at 2,400 calories before? And she just cracked up laughing. She was like, no, of course I didn't. I thought that I had to be super, super restrictive. That's actually one thing that I can't believe that I haven't mentioned this up to this point. You don't need to count, right? And actually, we're sort of getting into this a little late. We might bring this up the next podcast because April was the reason why we started to count. And early on, I used to make the argument a lot, right? I mean, like, before I started doing these podcasts with April, as an example, we weren't talking about counting calories. And I don't count calories right now, right? I do count calories on occasion, but usually it's to make sure that I'm eating enough, not because, I'm trying to restrict my calories. So we'll kind of deep dive that a little bit. That was actually a big theme that I was going to talk about. But I think that, part of the argument that we will make, in the next podcast is that how are we going to be able to coach you? That's where that's when we started to see like Eat to Perform go kind of crazy, right? Was when we started to introduce, we were trying to do it where you could eat intuitively. And certainly if you want to have the good majority of your carbohydrates and calories on workout days, and then be more fat reliant on rest days, you can do that. That's what I do, right? Though honestly, I do eat more calories and carbs than most people think on rest days. And I had to sort of learn that, and I learned that process by counting calories, ironically. And so we'll talk a little bit. Should we just like deep dive that a little bit more? Because I think that, April was really the reason why we started counting calories with Eat to Perform. And I came to that kicking and screaming, and April was right and I was wrong, because my thought process was, no one's going to want to stick to that for life. And I think April's argument, and I don't know, I guess I could let you state it, but I think your argument would be, if you never have an understanding, you'll never be able to eat intuitively correctly. Is that close to right?
Exactly. You have to have an idea as to how much you need to eat, and like what you were saying, some people assume they eat a lot, and then when they count, they're like, holy crap, I don't hardly eat anything, whereas some people think, that they're dieting and, they count their calories and they're like, holy crap, I'm eating a lot, so it could actually go both ways, so, but over time, like what you said, you can, I've done it for so long. I just keep my logging streak up, to be honest, but I know what, I know what 6 ounces of protein looks like. I know what, 75 grams of carbs look like. I know, and I know if I don't eat enough because I know how I feel, so.
Yeah, and oh, by the way, so do I, right? I mean, that's what I figured out, in the early days of knowing April. What were days where I was counting calories, were days that I was more conscious of what I was eating and stuff like that. And so, like, those lessons, and I talked a little bit about that, about having a plan and sticking to the plan, and made a blog post that's actually going to come out on Wednesday. We did have one question that I think I probably would have normally got to. I'm just going to kind of go through it real quick. Jenny was saying that she's a runner, and she was wondering about a weightlifting protocol. One of the reasons why I have one long run a week is because it just fits real well with the way that I weight lift. And so I will do some combination of high intensity work combined with strength. And so, I talk about it every week, so I don't really need to go super in depth with it. But basically, I lift heavy on Tuesdays. I'll do some level of muscle building on that day, and then I will do a short high intensity Tabata to end that workout. That's usually tomorrow's workout, so that's what I'll do tomorrow. Wednesdays is sort of like an optional muscle building hypertrophy work. And then, sometimes I will WOD on that day. Right now, I'm actually just building muscle. There's so many concepts that we sort of, could have gotten into that I'm sure we'll get into in the next few weeks. But just this, I think a lot of people, like today in my situation, if they weren't able to work out and they had a lot of food, they wouldn't have taken a rest day today. And the body doesn't work like that, right? I mean, like for me to just take that, one extra rest day that I would normally have, it's just going to mean that I'm going to be better for my workout on Tuesday and Wednesday, right? And so for Wednesday, I'm going to do muscle building. If I am working, like when we were doing training for the Granite Games, I wouldn't have done hypertrophy work. I would have done a WOD that day. Then Thursday's a rest day. Friday is my long day. So this week will be 18 miles. The next week, I think I come down to 15 miles before I head back up to 20. And then on Saturday is kind of a rest day, but I will often go for like a hike. I do have like walks, some days I don't, it's really more for relaxation. So I try not to burden myself with, if I don't walk today, I'll get fat. And then Sunday is sort of like a potpourri day. It sort of depends. But it was sort of interesting, after this Friday where, the last couple Fridays on Sunday, I wasn't always 100%. This Sunday, even though I was traveling, I was feeling really good. Like I would have been able to get in a good workout. And so I'm really interested to see. And one of the complaints that my wife was making was that my long endurance day was Friday, but it's also date night. And so I think she has high hopes for the intra feeding as well. So, I'm not such a bore on date night, or I'm not always, crying about, my legs hurting.
So here, wait a minute. When you just said that, here I am thinking that, your long runs on date night, and she's going to think that you might be too fatigued to finalize the date night that night. That's what I'm thinking, not about the food part.
Wait, you seem
to act all tired.
You seem to be implying that date night has an end game.
It is date night.
No, that is actually true. No, okay, so I'll tell you guys a little bit more personal than my wife will never listen to this, so I'm fine. But no, like even the days that you know like really dragged on me and my body. Normally if I have pizza or ice cream or something like that, um, you literally go from like fetal position, cut off my legs, to like, oh my goodness, I have all the energy in the world. And so I was getting some indications before this that food was fine, but it was really shocking, how having that food, how easy it was to do 16 miles. I mean, at 14 miles, I thought I was going to die. Then 16 miles, it was like, oh yeah, this isn't that big of a deal. I mean, it's, you always know you're doing a lot of work, right? But in terms of like the overall drag on your body, it feels fine. But just trust me, the promise of date night has always been fine, April. Don't worry your pretty little head about that one. So, all right, guys. Well, we're going to shut this down. Hopefully this was helpful. I do think that there's some ideas that we could have unpacked a little bit better. I definitely want to talk a little bit more about intuitive eating, because I think that that's something that is a goal for a lot of people, and it's something that I do. I know James does, and a lot of the Eat to Perform coaches do. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in an upcoming podcast. And unfortunately, we just ran out of time for this one. So I appreciate everybody being here, and we'll talk to you guys later. Bye for now.
Bye.